We will continue exploring Baroque instrumental music with Chapter 10, the Baroque Orchestra. We begin talking about the orchestra in the Baroque period because that's basically when it began. It's when the group of instruments known as an orchestra were first used in the world of music. This started with accompanying vocal music, such as operas and cantatas and oratorios, which we've studied in previous chapters. And eventually, orchestras were used on their own, just hired by the rich, the upper class, to provide music in their homes. At first, orchestras were made up of just bowed string instruments, and woodwinds and horns were added later. The first piece of music we will be exploring in this chapter is water music, which is a suite, or sorry, divided into three suites of dances. It is called water music because it was performed for King George II on his barge on the Thames River. Now, your first listening example is the minuet from Water Music. It is a piece of music that uses strings, horns, oboes, bassoon, and harpsichord. And when you listen to it, you will hear that it is in ABA form, or what we call ternary form, and that it is in triple meter. So you can click the link to the first listening example and hear that on your own. One genre of orchestral music that we will be talking about in this chapter, as well as future chapters as we move on to other periods of time, is the concerto. Now, the concerto comes from an idea from musicians to pit two different sounds against each other within a single piece of music. Now, these contrasting sounds come from very different sized groups, usually a large orchestra against a smaller group of instruments or just one instrument. And this type of music was called the concerto. The name of that was developed from the Latin word concertare, which means to fight or contend. As we talk about the concerto, we will be looking at two main types of concertos: the concerto grosso, which uses a small solo group and pits that sound against an orchestra, and the solo concerto, where you hear a solo instrument, an instrument by itself, against an orchestra. Now, when we listen to a concerto grosso, we will hear two different groups. One is a small group of instruments, as we stated earlier, and the other is the full orchestra. Now, the term that we use to identify the small group of solo instruments is the concertino, while the ripieno is the term to describe the full orchestra. Concerto grossos often have a three movement structure: a fast movement, followed by a movement in a slower tempo, and then concluding with a fast movement. Ritornello form is often used in the concerto grosso. Ritornello is the Italian word for return or repetition, and a piece of music in ritornello form introduces some thematic material, some bit of music that is brought back to the listener over and over through the piece of music. Now, the next piece we will be talking about are the Brandenburg concertos, and these are examples of the concerto grosso style. And these are six works that were composed by Johann Sebastian Bach, and they were written for Christian Ludwig, the Margrave of Brandenburg. And thus, they are named the Brandenburg concertos. When you listen to Brandenburg Concerto Number 5, our second listening example, you will hear the two different groups and the differences between them. This includes the concertino, the small group of solo instruments made up of flute, violin, and harpsichord, and the ripieno, the large orchestra, which includes the strings as well as harpsichord continuo. You will also hear that this example is in ritornello form. Again, the theme of the piece comes back every so often throughout the entire movement. In this chapter, we discuss the harpsichord. We've been talking about the harpsichord, the one of the main keyboard instruments of the Baroque period, for several chapters. You can read more about that instrument in your book. Other genres of music that we will be talking about include the Ripieno Concerto, which is a concerto that does not use a solo instrument or a group to to pit the two sounds against each other, and the Solo Concerto, which features a solo instrument, an instrument by itself, against a ripieno of a full orchestra. One of the most prominent composers of solo concertos was Antonio Vivaldi. We've talked about Vivaldi several times in our course. You can read more about him in your book. Le Quattro Stagioni, or The Four Seasons, was one of Vivaldi's most famous solo concertos. And it is an example of what we call program music. Program music being defined as an instrumental piece of music that is associated with a non musical idea. Of course, the non musical idea is, in this piece of music, is the Four Seasons, a set of four concertos where each concerto represents a different season in the year. When performing this piece, each of the concertos was precluded by a sonnet or a poem that described each season and told the listener what season they were listening to. When you listen to the first movement from Spring of Vivaldi's Four Seasons, you will hear many different sounds that clue you into the nature of the season. And Vivaldi used sounds through his orchestra as well as the solo violin to to exemplify that. And that concludes chapter 10.